Hey everyone, we've been taking a look at the Renaissance, the High Renaissance, and how Raphael uses the ideas of Leonardo Michelangelo to form his own individual unique style. Today I wanted to take a look at the late Renaissance and Mannerism in terms of the greater instabilities that Italy is facing and how this is going to shape and impact the art. That artists are always responding to the world that they live in, and so their art is going to be a reflection of their socio-political environment. And so, if we take a look at today at the books or the films that come out, they're a reflection of our own anxieties and fears. And so, if you think about all the Marvel films or the DC Comics films that are coming out, that might suggest that we are looking for something in these turbulent, unstable times, or the numerous dystopian films that are coming out that feels as though we're at the end of a major precipice and we're standing on the brink of extinction. These are reflecting the anxieties and concerns that we have. And generally when art is peaceful or life is peaceful and serene, art will generally reflect that. And when life is turbulent and unsettling, art will reflect that as well. And so I want to talk about how late Renaissance style and Mannerism started to emerge as a reflection of the greater instabilities that Italy was facing. Martin Luther begins the Reformation in Germany in 1517. John Calvin from Switzerland later follows suit and brings Calvinist ideas to the region. And the Catholic Church's strength was beginning to wane. Their kind of control on the theological mindset of Europe was beginning to lessen, and this is going to bring about instability. In addition to the religious instability, there was greater political instability. France invades Italy in 1498, and then they later come back and they sack Rome in 1529. And so there's a greater instabilities and uncertainties with these invasions happening from foreign invaders that are breaking up the relative peace and stability that the Medicis brought in Florence, that then reflected in the peace and serenity of the early and high Renaissance. Italy was under siege politically, religiously, and economically, and it shattered the peace and simplicity of the previous century, and this is going to change art. I wanted to take a look just briefly at the context of the Reformation, that this just didn't happen overnight. There's actually several moments when people started questioning the Pope's authority and what happened to them. But these are going to lead to kind of plant some seeds of doubt that question the Catholic Church, and they're going to pave the way for Martin Luther and the Reformation. One of them was the Cathars. The Cathars existed in France in the Middle Ages, and mainly what they argued, they were heavily influenced by Eastern philosophy and these Manichaean ideas of there's a good God and there's a bad God. Similar to Star Wars, there's a good side of the Force and a bad side of the Force. Those are Manichaean ideas, or the influence of Manichaean ideas. What the Cathars believed is that there's a good God that controls the physical world that we live in, and there's a bad God that controls the physical world that we live in, and a good God that controls the divine. And what they argue is that we need to forsake the physical world to focus on the eternal world. And so they felt anything that was physical, such as secular love, or such as eating meat or material possessions, they completely rejected any of that. And so marital relations were completely out for the Cathars. They believed that that was controlled by the evil God. They believed that material possessions were controlled by the evil God, and even eating meat was something that was too carnal for them, and so they were largely vegetarian. And so what they started doing is they started questioning they believed that they were kind of a branch of the Catholic Church, but they believed that they were a little bit more religious, or kind of had a higher calling, if you will. Well, the Pope didn't like that they were doing their own thing and having their own beliefs, and they were questioning his authority. And so what he did is he sends his bishops there to correct them and to help lead them back to the true light of Catholicism. And what happens is the bishops arrive with all of their kind of sacred clothing on and their jewels and their gems that they have acquired over the years, and the Cathars laugh at them because they say this is proof that the Pope is controlled by the evil God because of all the material possessions and the wealth of the Catholic Church. Well, the Pope didn't take too kindly to that, and so what he does is he sends his military there to, if I can't bring you back to the light by using reason, I'll do it with force. And so he sends his military there to try to weed out any of the Cathar doctrine. And what happens is the Cathars sees the Pope's military arriving, and they just go underground. So they're still having the same beliefs, but they're not just doing it openly. And so the military general writes back to the Pope, this is Pope Pius the Third, and says, we don't know who's a Cathar and who's a true believing Catholic. And the Pope, it wasn't Pius, it was Innocent the Third, said, burn them all and let God sort them out. And so that's what they did. They burned everyone in the village, and the idea was to let God sort them out. So it didn't necessarily matter if you were truly a Cathar or you were just an innocent Catholic. The idea was that to send a message of what happens when you defy the Pope. John Wycliffe was also part of this. He was in England and had a conflict with the Pope because the Pope at the time was in France during the Avignon papacy, because the Pope decided to move to France to get away from the Italian corruption of politics during the Middle Ages. And so what was happening at the time was England was at war with France and didn't like that the English had to pay tithes to a French Pope that's going to then be supporting the French king and the French monetary system. And so he had a problem with paying the Pope in France. And so he also didn't like that the church owned 1/3 of the property in England. And so this caused some greater political tensions with John Wycliffe. And what he argued was that, number one, the church should banish all property. They shouldn't own property. He also argued that Jesus in the Bible is all that a person needs to get to heaven. And the Pope was an institution created by man rather than God. And I think that's what really got him into trouble. And so what he does, he translates the Bible into the vernacular or common language to allow others to come to his own conclusions. And so before it was written in Latin, and not only scholars or theologians were able to read Latin, but translating into the common language made it more accessible to the average person. So the average person can read the Bible for themselves and make their own conclusions rather than having to rely on the clergy to tell them what the Bible says. And so what happens is Pope Gregory the 11th condemns him as a heretic, and he would have been burned, but the Duke of Lancaster protects him, so he was spared. Jan Hus was influenced by Wycliffe's ideas and taught these ideas in the east part of Europe. The church clamps down on his ideas, and they invited him to the Council of Constance, and he was burned as a heretic on July 6, 1415. And so these are the ideas of what happens when you start questioning the Pope's authority. We've already talked about Savonarola, who was a preacher of reform, who saw the concerns of the corruption of the church, and he suggested that the Pope needs to reform, and he was condemned as a heretic and burned in Florence, and we've talked about that in an earlier lecture. And that's where Martin Luther picks up. He takes these ideas of Reformation and he starts to question the church. Very similar, we'll take a look at Northern Humanism in an upcoming lecture, but very similar to humanist ideas in Italy, where they're going back to ancient Greek and Roman ideas. What we see in the North is they're going back to ancient Greek and Roman ideas, focusing on language, much like they did in Florence. But rather than taking a look at pagan ideas or stories, poets of Rome, what they're mainly focusing on are translations of the New Testament. And so the Northern Humanists want to understand the purity of Christianity. And what they found is they were reading these manuscripts, these old manuscripts in the original language. They start realizing that the Catholic Church is very different from what it used to be. And so Martin Luther, as kind of influenced by these Northern humanist ideas, started calling the Pope's authority into question. And he was trained to be a monk, and he didn't necessarily mean to start his own religion. But what he does is he tacks 95 theses to the door in Wittenberg, and you can see the door that he tacked them to on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And mainly this was just 95 things that the church was doing wrong, and this was a way to reform it. Pope Leo X, kind of ironically, he was a Medici. He was the second son of Lorenzo Medici, and Lorenzo argued that the way to have true power is to get someone into the Pope, because the Pope can kind of take power back by excommunicating you. But if you have influence within the Catholic Church, then you have greater political influence. And so Lorenzo wanted his sons to become clergy and leaders within the Catholic Church. And so two of them became cardinals, and one of them became Pope Leo X. And so Pope Leo X was having some major problems. We'll talk about this in the upcoming lecture as well, but we've already kind of discussed some of it to the extent of in the early part of the 1500s, St. Peter's Basilica was built, the foundation was starting to crumble because it was built on this kind of swampy, marshy land. And so what he had to do is he had to find a way to fund the new building of St. Peter's Basilica that was started by Pope Julius II. We talked about how Michelangelo wanted to get reimbursed for all of the marble for Pope Julius II's tomb, and he goes to the Pope throughout the week, and finally at the end of the week he goes back to Florence after smashing all of his designs in his studio. Being the reason that the Pope didn't see him was because he was busy trying to figure out how to reconstruct St. Peter's Basilica. And so, ironically, the foundation of St. Peter's Basilica starting to crumble was actually a larger metaphor of the Catholic Church, which is starting to crumble. And so when Pope Leo II took over, he had some massive debts that had been undertaken. One of them was to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. Another one was all of the art projects that Julius II had undertaken that put the church in a bind. Well, Pope Leo X, who is a Medici coming from a banking family, knows how to raise money. And he says if the church is in trouble financially, a good way to do it is to start raising revenue. One way that he raises revenue is by selling indulgences. And the idea for this is if you pay the church money, they can lessen the punishment for your sins. And so if you commit a crime, such as you're stealing, you give them $20 and all of a sudden you don't have to, they can absolve you of that particular sin. Or more perhaps insidious was they would send people out to go door to door, and they say, hey, do you remember your mother who passed away last year? If you give me $100 or whatever the case may be, whatever the sum was, you can lessen her time in purgatory and allow her to be able to be absolved into heaven. And so they would go door to door to try to get people to get people's money, and then they would somehow lessen the sins or the impact of punishments on their relatives. And so this was a way to raise money, and it was very successful. But Martin Luther saw the selling of indulgences as something that was problematic, and it wasn't part of early Christianity. And so this is really what creates this kind of rift between him. And so, ironically, the Medicis, which were part of the rise of the Renaissance and funding all the great artists, they kind of at the tail end they start leading to the Reformation, right? So if it wasn't for Pope Leo X, there may not have been a Reformation at this point, at least, right? So he kind of becomes this catalyst because of his actions to raise funds. What he argues, what Martin Luther argues, is the Pope cannot exceed authority to grant repentance. The Pope cannot remit guilt. He cannot have control over whether someone feels guilty or not. And the death puts an end to all claims of the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church can't come by your door and say, hey, I can, help save your father who passed away in purgatory. He suggests that death does kind of puts an end to the authority of the Catholic Church. And so there are limits to what a pope can and cannot do, right? So that was the main focus of his 95 Theses. It wasn't to try to step away from the Catholic Church. It was just to try to reform it to make it better. This is number 50 of the 95. He says, Christians should be taught that if the Pope knew the exactions of indulgent preachers, he would rather the Church of St. Peter were reduced to ashes than be built with skin, flesh, and bones of the sheep. And so this is the kind of that connection between trying to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica and having the funds to do that, and selling of indulgences to try to fund that, and Martin Luther's anger for using people's sins in order to fund the Catholic Church's desires. The Catholic Church responded to this. Number one, they excommunicated Martin Luther, and then he's protected by some German dukes, and so they weren't able to burn him at the stake, so they were a bit limited. But they excommunicated him. He takes the excommunication document and burns it in the city center of Wittenberg in Germany. And then everyone in town just like cheers. So, hey, look at this. We're defying the Pope. We can kind of do our own thing. And they see this as kind of a liberation. The Catholic Church responds to this by what is known as the Counter-Reformation. So Martin Luther stepping away and kind of creating this different religion. The Catholic Church then responds by doing some more kind of clamping down. One thing that they clamp down on is forbidden books. They says that there's an index of forbidden books that people should not read, and so the idea of banning books becomes paramount for this. Things that you should read and things that you shouldn't read. They also develop new monastic orders. The Jesuits start to come around, led by St. Ignatius Loyola. The Jesuits are the missionary arm of the Catholic Church, and they start going to places like Africa and North and South America to start building the Catholic Church and monasteries there and missions there to try to bring people in the world into the arm of the Catholic Church. And so the idea of trying to expand the influence of the Catholic Church. And they also they come together at the Council of Trent, and they start thinking about ceremonies, and they start thinking about art, and this is going to heavily impact art. And so in 1545 they come together, and you can see a representation of the Council of Trent. They're all meeting to saying, how do we respond to the Counter-Reformation? They reaffirmed the ceremonies, the things that Martin Luther condemned. They said, nope, these are extremely important. They reaffirmed indulgences, which was the main point of contention between Martin Luther and the Catholic Church. They reaffirmed relics, with Martin Luther criticized, and they start saying that art should be much more about conveying the Catholic Church's message more clearly. So within the context of the late Renaissance, what we see is a couple of ideas that are happening. One is the death of Raphael in 1520. Some people believe that he died of syphilis because he was a ladies' man and he died at a young age. New research suggests that he may have died from a lung disease from the symptoms he recorded in his journals. But nevertheless, his death marked the end of an era, the end of the Renaissance. It now caused more of a changing of a style. It's not that his death necessarily caused a change of his style overnight. It's just that artists started doing something different, trying to get out of his legacy, get out of his style, right? And so his lack of influence left a gaping hole that other artists are going to fill. What we also see is Charles V, who has a claim from Germany on northern Italy. He came from a long line of royals, and his family alliances gave him claim from Belgium to Germany and Austria, and then into northern Italy with Milan. And he revitalized the idea of the medieval monarch trying to unite Europe under one rule. And so the idea that's been happening since the Middle Ages is, let's just gather Europe all into one central rule, like unto the Roman Empire. And they've been trying to restore this for centuries. hasn't really worked, but Charles V gets pretty close because of his family alliances and all the different aunts and uncles and things that he has throughout throughout Europe. He starts claiming these lands and starts taking over territories, and he gets pretty close to doing that. And he wants to expand his influence over Italy. He's already expanded to Spain. And then what he does is he sides with Martin Luther against Leo X to expand his influence over the church in Italy. And so siding with Martin Luther helps him to be able to gain influence over Italy because it weakens the church's authority, right? On May 6, 1527, his military gets upset with him for not being paid. So they're already in Italy trying to make claim, but they're not being paid. And so an army of more than 20,000 soldiers invades Rome, what is known as the Eternal City, and violently loots and pillages it for a month. And so this kind of signals another transformation, that the sign of the times are changing, that Italy is no longer this area of stability and peace and serenity. It's now being invaded. The Catholic Church's power is waning, and so there's a lot of instability. And so what we see is a new style starting to emerge as a result of this, right? The death of Raphael is part of this, right? His influence is beginning to wane, and now there's new artists that are looking for a new style to try to represent the new changes that are happening. Pope Leo X was raised as a brother to Michelangelo. Remember, Michelangelo was taken into the Medici home and raised as a son. He commissions Michelangelo to complete a tomb for the Medici family in Florence. And so Michelangelo comes back to Florence and starts working on this. He was working on the tomb of Julius II at the time, so he's kind of constantly working on that throughout his life, completing the Moses and one of the slaves. But he's then called back to Florence to complete this tomb for Giuliano Medici. And what he has here is just day and night and dawn and dusk. And so he completes these two particular sculptures in Florence. And so he's kind of going back and forth between Florence and Italy. And then eventually he's called back to Rome to complete the altar wall in the Sistine Chapel. And so he completed the ceiling when in his 30s, and he was 61 when he was called back to complete the back wall. And so kind of ironically, he's, considers himself that sculptor, but he keeps being called back to do commissions for painting. Pope Clement VII, who was the Pope at the time, he became Pope in 1523, wanted to complete the wall on the altar. And he wanted it to be about the resurrection. I want you to think about why that is an important theme for the time and the historical context that we've been taking a look at. When he dies, Michelangelo no longer feels safe in Florence because of the current leader, and he leaves to Rome and becomes the supreme artist and architect for the papacy in the 1530s. And so this is where he kind of is in Rome and lurking about, and he gets this commission. Before Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which we see here, there was an Assumption, which is Mary being translated into heaven. The Catholic doctrine suggests that she didn't die, but God just kind of opens up the heavens and she is raised up into heaven, and that's known as the Assumption. There was an Assumption on this wall, painted by Perugino. Lorenzo, when he was under attack by the papacy, he sent down Botticelli and Ghirlandaio to paint the walls in the Sistine Chapel after that assassination attempt on his life, in an attempt to make peace. And then Michelangelo was later commissioned to return to this to complete the wall of the altar and then paint over that. And it was to be a piece on the second coming. But what we're seeing here is a couple of things. The theme is going to be very different from the creation, and that's going to be something that we need to take note of. And then the style is also beginning to change. No longer we see Michelangelo's early style. This is a later style of Michelangelo, which is more associated with Mannerism. I want to take a look about this. I want you to think about how the wall represents, or how he represents the scene, right? What message does he leave? And this is where he's kind of taking inspiration from. This comes from 2 Peter. And saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. But the heavens and the earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto a fire against the day of judgment and perdition of an ungodly men. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, and some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And so inviting all, even though there's this weakness, he's inviting all to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, that we see at the bottom right-hand side. The earth also, the works that are therein, shall be burned up. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of the Lord, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. And so these are two images on the side, on the left and the right-hand side, at the very top of the Last Judgment. What Michelangelo had to do is he had to build out this wall to be an overhang in order to compensate for the perspective. That if this was flat, the perspective would have been off, and so he builds this out in order to keep the perspective and make it look like it is visually accurate. But what we see here are the signs of the passions of Christ. On the left-hand side, we see the cross and then the crown of thorns that the angels are holding. And so they're kind of coming back to earth at the second coming, showing people what they have done, what wickedness has done. And on the right-hand side, we see the column that Christ was strapped to as they whipped him in order to kind of appease the Jewish leaders at the time. And so both of these are representative of the passions of Christ, the sufferings that he encountered at his death. And so kind of bringing these instruments back to show people what he's overcome, but also what humanity has inflicted upon him. And then we see here Christ at the very center with his hands up as though he's casting down the sinners into hell, and then raising up the righteous unto him, right? This piece marks the concerns of the time of the middle parts of the 16th century. Italy was falling apart with constant warfare. Christianity was falling apart with Luther and Calvin, and then Henry VIII in England. It seemed to many that this was the beginning of the end of the world, and so this seems to represent that, right? Those concerns. This piece is a call for righteousness to stay true to Catholicism. This is a direct warning from the Pope to the world. Be cautious and wary of your actions, otherwise you will be burned up at the last day. It also represents Michelangelo's new style. It's not as peaceful and serene as we see at the kind of the bottom center with his David piece. The ceiling at the bottom right-hand side was very simple. One or two objects were depicted in each of the settings. There were a lot of figures represented, but each image was individually represented and very simply done. The Last Judgment, on the other hand, immediately overwhelms the viewer, and purposefully so. It's meant to be overwhelming. It's meant to be more chaotic. It's meant to be more confusing. It's meant to take more time to digest and to think through, right, the chaos and anxiety that he's representing. Immediately overwhelms with its immensity and grandeur. There are bodies everywhere. Its composition, where the things are placed in the work in relation to one another, is much more chaotic. There are figures on the right and figures on the left, and in the center, Christ gives balance to it all, right? This kind of overflow of the work. However, the sheer number of individuals depicted with the complexity of each one is doing is very complex and directly contrasts the ceiling, his earlier style. Christ and Mary is shown here representative of Mannerism. Christ's body is almost like a serpentine figure as it kind of twists and contorts. He is kind of in motion here. His hand is raised in the air. He's not a static figure like David, just kind of looking off in the battlefield. He is a figure in motion. Michelangelo also focuses on the diagonal lines, the diagonal line of Christ's arm, the diagonal line of the gaze downward. He's looking off at the sinners. And then the diagonal posture of Mary as she kind of cringes, as she's trying not to be touched by the filth and sins of the world. Normally, she's represented as an intermediary between humanity and Christ, or humanity and God. She's kind of trying to reach out and help people into heaven. But here at the Last Judgment, it is too late. She is not going to be reaching out for those that are trying to get help. She's trying to stay clean and pure, and so she's kind of recoiling at the sins of the world. But what we see here is that they suggest this dynamic action and thought. Christ turns his head in contemplation about what is now to become. And notice how his left arm points at the spear wound in his side, demonstrating what he has had to overcome. And then his other hand is raising up to show the nail prints in his hands, and then his feet are strategically located to let us see the nail prints, to see what he has had to overcome. But both of them, Christ and Mary, are kind of huddled together. They are one in thought, one in action. He is no longer skinny as he was in Pieta, the earlier Michelangelo work. Mary is no longer in mourning. This is about victory of Christ and Mary. This is a celebration of the new. And at the bottom, there are people who have recently died who remained worthy and are received as saints into heaven. But others on our right-hand side, his left-hand side, are not so lucky. They're being cast down. Just a couple of quick images here. Some people argue that this is a representation of Adam coming back from the resurrection and turning towards Christ and looking towards Christ and Mary for guidance and direction. Just to take a look at a couple more of the iconography within the image, the people that are represented. This clearly is St. Peter, and what he is doing is he has two keys in his hands, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. That was supposed to be more of a metaphor key, but generally an art is represented as a physical key. And here he is returning those keys, and this is kind of an indication of the Catholic Church, right? You can leave and go to follow Martin Luther, or you can go and follow John Calvin, but it's the Pope that has the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and so this is him returning. So it's an indication of the Pope's authority, kind of an in-your-face sort of moment. This is his claim to power. So this is a direct response to Luther and Calvin in the north. There's a couple of other images. We've seen Saint Sebastian before as he's been tied up and put on in a column. And generally he's shown with arrows in him. Here he now takes out those arrows and he's holding up those arrows to show what he has overcome. And he's kind of pointing down towards the sinners. This is what you guys have done to me, but I have now overcome it, right? Even though he didn't die from the arrows, right? But he's still showing the instruments of his torture. A couple other images I just wanted to focus on just briefly here. At the bottom left, we see St. Catherine. She was an early Christian. She was the daughter of a royal pagan family. She's seen a heavenly vision of Madonna and child, and then she was converted. The emperor brought her before him and had his best philosophers argue against her reasoning and rationale for converting to Christianity. She defeated them all, and then as a result, she was imprisoned for her beliefs. 200 people visited her while she was in prison, including the emperor's wife. All 200 of them converted to Christianity. And after 10 days in prison, apparently, according to legend, she emerged more beautiful. And at this point, the emperor tried to marry her, but she refused, claiming that she was married to Jesus. And then he sentenced her to the torture wheel to be put to death. And you can see the torture wheel there with the spikes on it. And the idea here is it kind of pulls you apart slowly. But as she touched the torture wheel, it miraculously broke. And so here you see the torture wheel that is broke. And then she was later beheaded. She is shown here with a broken wheel. And anytime you see a Catholic saint, a woman with a broken wheel, it is St. Catherine. She is the patron saint of philosophers. and she's also the patron saint of craftsmen who work with wheels, right? So kind of that connection. And then next to her is, and just on top, is Saint Blaise, who was tortured by iron combs. You see the iron combs in his hands. He was a physician in the 4th century. He healed both physically and he became a healer of souls. He became widely known, and the Roman emperor arrested him and scoured him with iron combs. Didn't kill him, though, and then he was later beheaded. Catherine and Blaise were later changed. Initially, Michelangelo kind of represented all of the figures without clothes on. It was a little bit later the Catholic Church said, okay, this is a little bit extreme. And so in kind of response to Martin Luther's questioning of art, which we'll take a look at later, they start to, a later artist comes back and starts putting clothes on them. She was originally without clothes. He was originally without clothes. But they also changed, not only adding clothes to her and him, they also changed his head. He was kind of looking over her suggestively, which they thought was a little problematic. And so now they changed the direction of St. Blaise's head to now look towards Jesus instead. This one is St. Lawrence, who was also an early Christian. He was in charge of the church's money. And one day a dignitary asked the church to pay money. And so what St. Lawrence does is he brings forth a lot of the poor and shows where the church's money is coming from, or going to, rather. And he says, if you take money from us, you're taking money from them because we're helping them to be able to sustain themselves. And the dignitary didn't like being showed up and humiliated like that. And so they ordered him to be executed, and they put him on a gridiron or a grate and put him over hot coals. And so you see the gridiron that he has in his arm there. And then after a period of time, he yelled, "I'm well done on this side. Turn me over." And so he kept his humor up until the end. And so now he's associated as the patron saint of cooking, barbecues, chefs, and interestingly, comedy. And so he's kind of the patron saint of that. And then this one's the most famous one. So this one's just at the feet of Christ. This one is Saint Bartholomew. He's one of the many saints that surround Jesus. He too is slightly turned and off-center, showing that kind of serpentine look of Mannerism. He was a martyr who was put to death by being skinned alive. He holds the instruments of his death in his right hand. So they put a sharp tool under the skin and what's called flayed, and they just take the skin off. And then he had skin in his arm of a supposed sinner. And some people argue that this is the only self-portrait in painting of Michelangelo. Many believe that Michelangelo felt his soul was in jeopardy of hellfire and placed himself as one of those who will suffer at the second coming. Others believe that this is Michelangelo's commentary about the critics of his day constantly flaying him or constantly skinning him alive and criticizing his works of art. So kind of an interesting kind of self-commentary that we see within the image. And just kind of down at the very center, these are the trumpets that blow to signal the second coming. And this is the war between good and evil. Notice the book of life at the kind of bottom right. This is kind of the reading of what all the people have done. So this is the collection of the history of humanity. It consists of all of their actions, and now they are blowing the trumpets to raise the 144 righteous into heaven. And so this is one on the our right-hand side. On Christ's left-hand side, these are the sinners that are trying to, their last-minute prayers or kind of fighting each other, trying to find their way to heaven, but alas, it is too late for them. These are the righteous on Christ's right-hand side and our left-hand side. These are the people that are kind of rising up. These are the people that were true to Christianity. More specifically, in this case, true to Catholicism would be the message of Michelangelo's day, and they're being raised up to heaven to be able to encounter or join the ranks of the saints that surround Christ and Mary. These are the sinners. This person here is tormented by the decisions that he has made, racked with guilt, and the demons now grab him and pulling him down to hell. What you see here is Charon on the, according to Dante, Charon is the riverboat driver that takes people from from the world into the eternal resting place in hell. And here he has an oar to whack all those who get out of line, and they all kind of cower, trying to stay away from the evil whacks. And then you just see these evil serpentine kind of figures, these demons that are kind of pulling people. Or this person here is being speared and then held up, being tortured in death. This is just kind of a representation that kind of makes the last judgment come alive.
All images of the judgment up to that time had God on a throne in the center, with angels and saints ranged along horizontal lines. Michelangelo again started an artistic revolution, developing his story along perpendicular axes. His work invades the enormous white wall that seems to explode in a whirlwind of figures that all rotate around a central figure, apparently without rules. All it takes is to observe with a little more attention to see that the scene begins on the left, where the blessed rise towards heaven. God is in the center, but this time looks like Christ the Judge, and his position is the same as the Apollo of the Belvedere, the famous statue found in the Vatican and imitated throughout the entire Renaissance. His hand, in a circular movement, moves the whole scene, letting the damned fall towards hell and helps the blessed into heaven. The Last Judgment of the Sistine Chapel has nothing to do with the anatomy lessons of the scene. Here, the naked bodies, particularly those of the damned, no longer have noble and composed positions. Instead, they're gawky and muddy as they scream and scramble. They're almost caricatures of all that is negative in the human condition. If you concentrate on the scene, you can almost hear the screams of pain, the noise of the souls rushing to their own destinies, and the deafening trumpets that announce the end times. Only in the center does the scene seem suspended in an unreal silence. Even the saints and martyrs, all turned towards Christ, are anxious and terrified as they wait for the final verdict to be pronounced. Even the Madonna is timid and resigned at his side. Some of the blessed kiss each other and hug one another with enormous relief. Up above, outside the circular movement, angels almost threateningly carry the cross and symbols of the Passion. Christ the Judge is wrapped in a blinding light. Nonetheless, both the damned and the blessed can't help looking towards him. In the Last Judgment, too, the images don't all have the same perspective. The figures of the blessed and the damned are randomly grouped or distance themselves, leaving blue spaces. Every corner is frescoed with infinite care given to the tiniest details. Some of the saints are easily recognizable because they hold the symbols of their story or their martyrdom in their hands. St. Peter, on Jesus' right, holds the two keys. St. Lawrence holds the grape, and St. Sebastian kneels, holding the arrows with which he was martyred. One of the most famous images is St. Bartholomew, who died skinned alive. The saint, seated on a cloud, is painted as Pietro Aretino, the Tuscan poet who had dared to criticize nudity. But the most celebrated detail of all is the skin that the saint holds in his hand, in which Michelangelo put his self-portrait. In fact, at the height of his creative work, the artist truly felt skinned alive by those insistent criticisms. On the lower right, the angels of the apocalypse sound their trumpets with every breath in their body, blowing out their cheeks to the bursting point to wake the dead. Angels and demons pitilessly let the desperate damned fall into hell. As your gaze drops slowly downwards, the scenes become more and more terrible until you arrive at Charon, who beats the souls away from his boat with an oar and sends them off towards Minos, the judge of hell, wrapped in a serpent. The figure of Minos, besides being recognized as the Pope's master of ceremonies, was also identified with Pierluigi Farnese, son of Pope Paul III, who, in Rome, was known for acts of violence and sodomy. On the left, according to the theory of the resurrection of the flesh, the reborn rise into heaven, getting their bodies back, some of them holding a rosary, a criticism of Luther's theories.
All right, thinking about this, right, in context, what argument do you think Michelangelo makes for the Last Judgment? Consider what he emphasized and how might this reflect the more unstable times that are happening in Italy. And so what is he responding to, and how do we see that response reflected within his work, right? So how is this very different from his earlier works of the Pietà or of David or even of the Sistine Chapel? How do we see a different kind of message being emerged from them? All right, so examine also something to think about in context. Examine the view of the human condition as seen in the creation and Last Judgment. So how do we see ourselves? How do we understand our place in the world according to Michelangelo's art, right? So as he's thinking about humanity, thinking about where we are, how do we see a different change, a different understanding of ourselves emerging between the time when he painted the Sistine ceiling and the time when he paints the Last Judgment on the back wall, right? What similarities do you notice? What differences are there, right? So what is he celebrating here? What is he celebrating or criticizing here, right? So again, thinking about them and kind of seeing the larger picture, the forest through the trees, so to speak, as we see these as larger messages and understandings, windows into their world to understand the world that they're creating, right? Again, thinking about the contrasting the representation of the human body between the earlier style of Michelangelo and then the Last Judgment. How does Michelangelo portray the body differently? I want you to think about his representation in these kind of different works, right? His earlier work with David and then also the Last Judgment. Let's take a look at a couple other later works that Michelangelo worked on. This is known as the Pietà Bandani of Florence, and it's mainly named after the patron who did it. So he does 3 different Pietas in his life. We've already studied the first one in Rome, which he establishes a name for himself. I want to take a look at 2 of his later works to show this new style, this kind of emerging Mannerist style. He did this one when he was 75 years old. And this is, again, the second of the third that he'll do. We'll take a look at his last one, which is also super interesting. And he worked on this one until his death at 85. And so he worked on this one for about 10 years, using more than one figure on a block of marble, which is kind of an interesting approach because we've really only seen, him do 1 or 2 images, but this one is much more complex. This is Jesus that we see at the center front, right? And then Mary to our right is holding him up. And then on the left, Mary Magdalene is also holding him up. And then the figure in the background is identified as either Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea. I've heard arguments for both of them. Vasari states that Michelangelo completed this as a funerary monument, but he was unsatisfied with the work. And so some suggest that he was angry and frustrated that wasn't turning out. And so he takes a rock hammer and shatters the arm of Christ. You can kind of see where it's cracked on that left elbow down. It is believed that the face of the figure Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea is a self-portrait of Michelangelo. So again, he's kind of inserting himself into the work. We've seen this a little bit with the Pietà, his early version of the Pietà in 1498. Then we see this a little bit again when he comes back to the Last Judgment ceiling. And then we also see this again in this version of the Pietà, right? So again, kind of an interesting that he continually inserts himself, and I want us to think about why that might be. Is it because it's just easier to do because an artist always has, his or her face? or is there a kind of a message, something that he's thinking about a little bit more deeply? So some people argue that he was angry and broke the arm out of frustration. Maybe it was because he was getting a little bit older. Notice how some people argue that one of his fellow students kept bugging him when he's going to be done, when he's going to be done. He just got really frustrated and tired of it, and that could have led to a fit of anger. Another one suggested that he was frustrated with the actual marble itself, that it was just really too hard to really work with, and so whatever it was, he did damage the work of art. Notice how Christ is missing another leg; it just kind of disappears, and then he didn't really fully complete this in his life. Notice how the face of Mary is not really completed, and then someone took over this work later. And they thought, well, since it's so close to being finished, there was the patron says, maybe another artist can take it over. And so you can see how the other artists kind of struggled with that with Mary Magdalene, because the figures were supposed to be kind of huddled up next to each other. But Mary Magdalene here is much too small. And so whenever you're working with subtraction, you take a piece off and it's gone. And so, you can kind of restore it as they kind of restored his elbow right there, but it's tricky. And so some argue that the artist that worked on it later took too much off, and so that's why there's that gap between her and the body of Christ, and why she looks a little bit too small, is that another artist worked on it. But again, thinking about these in kind of unison, the earlier style versus the later style, I want you to think about, what differences do we notice? And stylistically, how do we see early Renaissance, or kind of high Renaissance rather, and then how do we see kind of this late Renaissance, or it's also known as Mannerism style, emerging? And then this one is the last work the last Pieta that Michelangelo did. This is known as the Rondinini Pieta. And just for the patron, it's named after the patron, just as a way to distinguish it between the two other Pietas. This one's kind of interesting, though, because it looks like that Mary is either getting a piggyback ride, so it's like Jesus is supporting Mary, or Mary is holding up the dead body of Jesus. And so it shows this kind of connectedness between them, that they're supporting each other. It kind of shows that intricate kind of relationship, that they both need each other in order to kind of make Christianity work, that Christ needed Mary's love, support, right, to sustain him, and then she needs Christ as the Savior to be able to enter into heaven. And so it shows that kind of intimate connection between mother and son. Thinking about the works in totality, as we start to kind of to end our discussion of Michelangelo, we've studied multiple works by him throughout his career. Many have been self-reflexive, as we see with his early version of the Pieta. He writes, Michelangelo Buonarroti did this, and that's a way of signing the work, but it's also a way of placing him within the context of responsibility for what's happened, right? Some of them express his own inner anxiety. How might these reflect an artist trying to come to terms with his own salvation? Do you think he finds greater peace throughout his life, right? As he's kind of struggling in the back of his mind, that trauma of Savonarola and his message in Florence probably impacted him throughout his life, and seeing himself kind of disconnected from God, and so he's struggling to overcome that. I want you to think about how we see this, or maybe not, throughout his works that we've studied. And then the last question I want to kind of leave you with, in terms of this changing style of late Renaissance or Mannerism. We've studied Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. I want you to think about which is your favorite, which has left a lasting impact on you, and which do you think that you remember in 5 years. So it's just some thoughts to think about as we think about how art responds to the eras in which they are created.